Hey everyone, guess what? Becoming a fossil is an extremely rare thing, so rare that we can only dream it'll happen to one of us. So it's no surprise that, relatively speaking, fossils are quite uncommon. And yet, at the end of the day, Earth has still seen tons of life come and go. I mean, right at this very second, quintillions of animals are sharing the planet with us. So it's not hard to see why fossils still end up being very numerous and entire industries exist around them. So what happens when even the scientific community, the smartest people on the planet, have to throw their hands up and say, we have no idea what this thing is? Get ready, because today we're diving deep into the world of the weirdest fossils, the ones that have left paleontologists scratching their heads, speechless, and maybe even considering a career change. That's right, most of the fossils we find are pretty normal, in the sense that we've seen them before. Even when they represent a new species, they generally fall under something we've already dealt with. For example, a new dinosaur might just be another species of hadrosaur. But every now and then, it's really quite seldom that we actually make a discovery that is both new and mind-boggling. Something that just looks wrong from the get-go. Today, we're going to explore some of those cases, ancient creatures that have left paleontologists scratching their heads, unsure of what they've stumbled upon, even to this day. Get ready to meet some prehistoric monsters that might just make you exclaim, oh my gosh, what even is that? The Tully monster, a nightmare from Mazon Creek, Tullimonstrum gregarium. Perhaps there's no better case than the Tully monster, lovingly nicknamed the Tully monster. And honestly, monster might be the closest you'll get to figuring out what this thing was, because it was not only terrifying and crazy looking, but also incredibly confusing. Its modern story started all the way back in 1966, when an amateur collector named Francis Tully was exploring the Carboniferous Mazon Creek Formation in Illinois. During his expedition, he stumbled upon not one, but multiple strange fossils. He could tell they were organisms, but of what kind, he had no clue. Even after collecting a few and studying them more closely, he still couldn't gather a guess. So, he decided to get an expert's opinion and take them to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. But to his surprise, they were just as stumped as he was, being absolutely perplexed by the odd features of this new creature. A cigar-like body, triangle fins, long-stalked eyes, and a proboscis-tipped mouth, making it kind of look like an animal straight out of Subnautica, and a horrifying one at that, with the only saving grace being its small stature. Most of the fossils were under 14 inches long. Its sheer oddness attracted a lot of attention, both domestically and internationally. And yet even then, with many researchers looking at it, no one could come up with a good idea of what it was. Different guesses included that it was a mollusk, arthropod, conodont, worm, tunicate, or just some kind of vertebrate. The only thing they could really all agree upon was that it almost certainly lived in water. Though Illinois is nicknamed the Prairie State, hundreds of millions of years ago, it was submerged by a shallow tropical sea, specifically part of the ancient Western Interior Seaway. And given where the Tully monster specimens were found, it's presumed to have been an open marine organism that would occasionally be swept under the shore, and thus leading to its multiple groupings. This also suggested the idea that it was free-swimming, in other words, not clamped to the seafloor or any structure. From then to now, nearly 60 years later, we really don't know much more. Heck, we've pretty much only concluded that there are bilaterians, which honestly doesn't say much considering how immensely broad this classification is, seeing that, literally 98% of all animals fall under it. While a few have claimed to have figured this strange creature out, nothing has stuck. Recent studies, particularly a 2016 paper published in Nature, tried to classify it as a primitive, lamprey-like vertebrate. However, a 2017 study in Paleontology rebutted this, pointing out features inconsistent with vertebrates and suggesting it's more closely related to invertebrates. This highlights just how fierce the debate still is. But, on the bright side, we do think we know a bit more about its lifestyle now. Scientists are suggesting that its odd mouth, equipped with sharp teeth, rendered it a carnivore who hunted in the ocean's water columns and preferred muddy waters. Beyond that, the dude's a mystery. The Tully monster is even recognized as the official state fossil of Illinois, a tribute to a creature we still can't definitively classify. The alien goldfish, a head-scratcher from Montana, Typhlosis wellsii, and oddities out of the USA do not end in Illinois. It was in Montana that a fossil was located in the 70s, which was so unlike anything seen before that it was simply dubbed an alien goldfish. This was Typhlosis welsii. This remarkable find came out of the Bear Gulch Limestone Formation, a famous Lagerstätte, fossil-rich site known for exceptional preservation of soft tissues and happened to be even more ancient than the Tully monster, dating to the Serpicovian age some 330 million years ago. The fossil was so confusing to researchers that it actually went unreported for a very long time, as no one wanted to deal with the headache of trying to figure out what it was. The only real lead they had was that its body was spindle-shaped, teeny tiny, and possessed one single tail at the end, suggesting, like our friend Tully, it could swim on its own. But besides this, nada. Well, actually there was more, but it really only set scientists back more, adding just head-aching amounts of confusion. It had no other exterior appendages, lacked a midsection or anus, and literally had an organ that was never seen before or since, which is now dubbed a Pharaohiscus. And yeah, we have no clue of what it does, except that it held high concentrations of iron. So what do you do when something is very old and super strange? Well, you find an equally bizarre family and then cram it in there. In this case, the conodonts, a group of jawless vertebrates found virtually everywhere. And this claim wasn't too outlandish, as paleontologists were thrown a bone after discovering a brand new specimen with conodont-like teeth, a great sign that it might have been one after all. Briefly, scientists were able to take a breather. However, things were soon upended as one researcher realized these teeth did not belong to the alien goldfish, but rather represented something it ate, as they were located in its guts, and thus putting us back to square one, except with the added information that we're now pretty sure it was a carnivore. Sadly, this new info remained the only update on Typhlosis for 3 decades. But it was finally interrupted by a groundbreaking statement in 2022, published in Nature, that Typhlosis was maybe, not for sure, but just maybe, a mollusk. Now, you may want to sit down for this part, but this claim came after the discovery that it had a toothy tongue that had shot at prey from its guts? Sounds kinda out there, yeah? It turns out that some animals today do something a bit like this. Namely, again, our friends the mollusks, with their tongue-like structures called radulas, and thus leading to our friend Typhlosis being linked to them. Only problem is, though, that it also has turned out that radulas have evolved independently in non-mollusks too, a prime example of convergent evolution, where similar traits evolve in unrelated species. So, in other words, it may be too early to say what this blob-like creature really was. This is definitely one of the hardest cases to crack out there at the moment. But hey, at least it's a solo job, as sometimes puzzling fossils come in pairs. The H and Y animals, an alphabet from prehistory, Ediacaris and Echinacea. And actually, in this case, they came from the same place as the Tully monster, the Mason Creek Formation. It was here that 2 different fossil discoveries were made that stumped people enough that the best analogies they could come up with was to explain them with a literal alphabet, specifically 2 letters. These fossils would eventually be named Ediacaris and Echinacea, and though not really related, they have become known together as the H and Y animals respectively. Ediacaris, the H1, was arguably the weirder of the 2 in the looks department, and it really did resemble the letter H, with a weird growth in the middle of it. Now, unsurprisingly, we know very little on why it was shaped like this, or what the functions of its limbs were. Yet, researchers guess it might have fed on free-floating particles and organisms and was likely a colonial animal that grew for the entirety of its life, evidenced by specimens widely varying in size. Besides coming in different sizes, they also seem to have come in different shapes. How fun! As that sac which stuck out could be circle-shaped, heart-shaped, and perhaps some other shapes, so it really depended on the specific individual. While this is a very big if, researchers think that of all the phyla, it's most probable that Ediacaris belonged to the Hemichordata, which includes things like acorn worms and terebranchs. If this is correct, it would make it a rare fossil record for this often overlooked phylum. But ironically, its fellow alphabet buddy, the Y-shaped Echinacea, looked in a way more tame than H, but has been so far more problematic, at least taxonomically. This is mainly because it bears some strong similarities to sea anemones, which are part of the phylum Cnidaria, characterized by radial symmetry and a sac-like gut. However, Echinacea has things you don't find in the group, such as bilateral symmetry, a complete gut, and get this, all but, and thus upending any inclinations that we knew what it was. And for now, we can only say that it was an animal who also had a mouth, mind you, that came in the form of a large slit in between its so-called arms. Yet what these arms did is unknown, and frankly, they might not even be arms. The Ediacaran monsters, when the whole world glitched. Namacalathus and Dickinsonia. If you haven't pieced it together yet, the Cambrian was a weird time, but somehow there was a period that had it bested and contained life so problematic that a researcher simply ended up grouping them all together. And that is the Ediacaran biota. As its name implies, this group is from the very ancient Ediacaran period, which transpired between 635 and 538.8 million years ago, and represents the first time when fossils really depicting macroscopic life became common. Many weird and basically unknown things lived during this time, but one of the stranger genera to emerge, which is saying something, was a thing that I can only describe as looking like an Elden Ring boss if it was a tree made of flesh, which might actually be a thing given how weird that game is. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Namacalathus, a being that is essentially the combo of some of the most horrifying traits ever. When its fossil was first unearthed in Namibia, people could only conclude that it resembled something you'd expect an alien to live in, given its openings at the top. Yet beyond this, they had no clue what they stumbled upon. It did kind of resemble a tree, like I said, though at the same time, when examining the materials of its so-called trunks, they realized that in life, they would have been calcified. So, in other words, this was no tree, and rather an animal, and represented the oldest evidence we have of a skeleton. And lo and behold, eventually fossils representing what covered its body were located, which only served to make it stranger and more nightmarish. Because, as it turns out, Namacalathus was a real-life monster. No, really, this thing was covered in endless amounts of grasping tentacles and rows of spines that could have shredded anything that it made contact with. And remember those openings I was talking about? Well, turns out there were trypophobia-worthy biological windows, so to speak, that varied in size and in life would have been filled with organic matter. Now, what they did is not known, but I sure hope for its neighbor's sake that they didn't have anything to do with eating. And to just make it a bit more of an oddball, it turns out that these windows didn't just come in circle shape, but virtually every strange shape you can imagine, including but not limited to a heart, the moon, hexagons, heptagons, and so forth. Oh, and did I mention that it could adjust its size based on where it lived and basically pop up just about anywhere? Well, yeah, it could, though naturally, given its terrifying appearance, it did have a preference for living in the abyss, like literally the abyssal plains. One thing to me that is quite infuriating is despite looking like perfect symmetrical beings, they are actually known for being slightly asymmetrical, displaying glide symmetry, as one side does not mirror the other, but rather is a repeated offset of the previous segment. Take a look at this. See how the lines don't line up? Unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. And another interesting thing about them is they might not even have left any descendants behind, which, if was the case, means that they are evolutionary dead ends. But honestly, good riddance. The Franceville biota. 2 billion years of, is it alive? Now, I know the one-upping of the weirdness is probably coming quite repetitive, but, and it's a big but, there is somehow another period that holds an edge over all others in unanswered questions. The Ryacian. Now, to get here, you gotta go way back. Like way, way, way back. 2.1 billion years to be exact, when the Earth was a freak show in every sense. I mean, after all, the Ryacian does translate to stream of lava. It was during this time that a certain area rose that would one day give birth to what researchers have dubbed the Francevillian biota. Specifically, in Gabon, Africa, scientists led by Abderrazak El Abani discovered a large area of black shale deposits which dated to the Ryacian and contained lots and lots of odd structures. Many were a bit disc-like and were either circular or elongated. Then, while rarer, subsequent discoveries unveiled other types of structures as well that included things that were more like tubes, strings of pearls, and even something that resembled a flower. And, in fact, their forms and characteristics are so perplexing that no one even knows for sure if we can call them fossils. At first, the researchers who discovered the site described them as colonial organisms, who are multicellular and probably eukaryotes. However, not everyone was on board. arguing instead that they weren't alive and rather had been created by inorganic pyrites or were artifacts of diagenesis, geological processes that alter sediments after deposition. The problem here was that the site was over 400 million years older than the previously known oldest example for multicellular life, so saying that they're eukaryotes is quite the claim. Imagine that, a find so confusing that we are only now deciding if we can truly label them as fossils. Ironically though, if it does turn out that the Francevillian biota was actually biota, we do already have some ideas on how they might have lived. Given their disc-like shape and lack of locomotion, they probably were not free swimmers. Instead, being planktonic organisms, they relied on water columns found in shallow, hot deltas, which were actually a rarity at the time, as Earth was really lacking in land back in those days. This showcases the early diversity and adaptability of life, even in the most extreme early Earth environments. Nectocaris, the shrimp that became a squid, and then, who knows? The funny thing about this case, though, and the others I mentioned, is that while a lot of confusion has come from strange appearances, there are actually cases where the animal has caused a lot of head-scratching, yet actually resembles life we are very familiar with. In other words, let me introduce you to Nectocaris. In 1910, this fossil was discovered in our old friend the Burgess Shale in British Columbia, Canada, one of the world's most famous fossil sites for its exceptional preservation of soft-bodied organisms. At the time, so many fossils were coming out of the place that this one was essentially buried and forgotten about. Yet, a single specimen eventually made its way back to relevancy and was described by an English paleontologist named Charles Doolittle Walcott, who explained that this was a completely new, mysterious creature that was a bit like a stretched-out shrimp, hence its name, Nectocaris, which means the swimming shrimp. The man who officially described it was a bit perplexed because it did share some similarities with arthropods, but its fins were basically the opposite of what you'd expect to see in one. Arthropod fins or appendages are typically jointed and arranged differently, while Nectocaris had large lateral fins. Given the conflicting findings, he was unable to say what it was with confidence and left it unclassified. But at some point, an Italian paleontologist, Guido Teruzzi, curious about its mysterious nature, looked over some photos of the fossils and thought that he had it all figured out, suggesting that it was a chordate, focusing on its tail fin and what he called its notochord, a distinctive feature found in this phylum, including vertebrates. And this stuck pretty well for over 20 years, actually. Until, that is, some rather important news came to light. It turns out that the original fossil was no bueno. In other words, incomplete. And not just a bit, because in 2010, over 91 more specimens in much better condition were uncovered that revealed that it didn't look like a deformed shrimp, but instead more like this. A squid-like creature which had just 2 tentacles, a flat kite-shaped body, 2 stalked eyes, and then weirdly, no visible mouth or opening except for a large funnel, which has been touted as a possible reversible proboscis, aka it could turn it inside out. Freaky! In many ways, seeing that it now looked a lot like a cephalopod, you would assume that the mystery was now resolved. And indeed it was proposed that Nectocaris was a brand new cephalopod, and the first one at that, being 30 million years older than anything known previously. But of course, when there is a new answer, there is bound to be a new problem. In this case, its appearance went against everything we know about cephalopod evolution. It was kind of like if a paleontologist found an animal resembling a modern human before any of the most primitive primates had even appeared. This is why the cephalopod idea was ultimately thrown out. And lo and behold, we are now back to square one with the animal being indeterminate. The only major update being that in 2019, a very similar fossil was found that was chalked up to being a very close related relative and thus named Nectopteryx, and together the two have created the controversial and currently homeless family, the Nectocarididae. So, to wrap it all up, fossil life is pretty confusing sometimes. Science has come a long way. We have advanced technology, the greatest brains on the planet, but there are still tons of wacky things in the history of life on Earth. Every time we find an answer, the fossil throws 10 new questions at us, and sometimes even a few new concepts that make us question everything we thought we knew. It just goes to show that the journey of discovering life on our planet is still very long and full of surprises. Who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one to find another mind-boggling fossil and make scientists scratch their heads all over again. If you made it this far on this bizarre fossil journey with me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for Beast Lore and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next deep dive into scientific mysteries. Share this video with your friends if you think they'll also enjoy these mind-bending stories. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Zoo.